What's up guys, Untitled Studios here, and today will be the start of my series on analyzing elections across the 21st century, at least that's how I'm starting it out. This is specifically covering one of the most underlooked elections in the 21st century, and that is the 2004 presidential election. This particular election pitted incumbent President George W. Bush against Massachusetts Senator John Kerry, and it's one of the most under-talked about elections in the 21st century. Despite the fact that there is a lot of history that's gone on in this election, it's one that is very, very well forgotten. So, we're going to start off with a pretty basic series in several parts discussing the history and the results of the 2004 presidential election. So, starting off, the 2004 presidential election, as stated previously, pitted incumbent President George W. Bush against Massachusetts Senator John F. Kerry. Now, in this election, there are a few notable facts, especially when comparing it to our modern day elections and recent elections in history. For example, this was the last time, as of the 2020 election, in which the Republican candidate actually won the popular vote, and this was also the last time that the Republican candidate won both of the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. And despite that, he pretty much has the lowest Electoral College count for a Republican president, given the fact that the next Republican to be elected president managed to win more Electoral College votes despite losing the popular vote by almost 2.5 points. In this scenario, the Republican won the popular vote by 3 points. In this case, the incumbent president, George W. Bush, specifically won 50.73% of the popular vote to John Kerry's 48.27%. And that 48% number is definitely one that Democrats have probably known fairly well. That is very similar to the number that Hillary Clinton got in 2016. And despite the Republican candidate Donald Trump running 2 points under, 5 points under George W. Bush in this election, he managed to win that election with more electoral votes than George W. Bush did in this particular election. That's also not the only thing of note. This was also one of the many times in which the Rust Belt was very competitive. Now, granted, this was also the last time in which a Republican managed to win the election without carrying the Rust Belt, again, as of 2020. Of course, in 2024, 2028, future elections, if you're watching this in the future, something could, of course, change. This was also the last time that the Republican candidate carried New Mexico, as well as Colorado, Nevada, and Virginia, again, as of this election. In this election, Georgia voted for the Republican candidate by almost 17 points. Then, 16 years later, it would vote for the Democrat in the presidential election, as well as in the succeeding two Senate elections for the Georgia Senate seats. So right now, Georgia has been pretty much transformed into a blue state, although it is still very, very, very purple. As of this time, the purple states included Ohio, Iowa, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, Oregon, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and by some accounts, even New Jersey, Virginia, and Hawaii. Oh, and of course the honorable mention of Florida. You cannot forget Florida when it comes to early 2000s elections, or even modern elections for that matter. This was the Republican candidate's biggest margin of victory in Florida for the entire 21st century. Funny as it was coincidentally the smallest only 4 years prior at 537 votes. So, what are some other fun facts about the 2004 election as an overall category before we get into specifics? Well, like I mentioned before, Hawaii was considered a toss-up. Kerry won it by only 8 points, and Real Clear Politics actually had this as a toss-up in their race ratings prior to this election, which is very, very fascinating. So there are plenty of fun things to talk about in the 2004 election. This is also the last time that North Carolina was decided by double digits on the presidential level. Very, very interesting. And this was especially funny given the fact the vice presidential candidate on the losing side was a senator from North Carolina, John Edwards. Also, fun fact, this was also a situation in which Minnesota actually gained an electoral vote, or I should say, Kerry lost an electoral vote to his running mate, John Edwards, where there was actually a faithless elector that cast their ballot for John Edwards for both the presidential and the vice presidential ticket. This wasn't like in 1988 where the ticket was swapped and Edwards was Kerry's presidential nominee, but this was actually a scenario in which Edwards was nominated for both the presidency and the vice presidency, which technically means that John Edwards actually got more votes for vice president than Kerry got for president in the Electoral College, only by one measly vote. So that is also another fun fact. This is also a scenario in which Iowa and New Mexico were incredibly close as they were in 2000. They were tilt blue in 2000, and they were tilt red in 2004. Wisconsin and Pennsylvania did not move beyond their classifications, neither did Minnesota from 2000, whereas Michigan had gone from a likely Gore state in 2000 to a lean Kerry state in 2004. Kerry did pretty much hold most of the margin, though, and fun fact, this Rust Belt looks very, very, very familiar if you are a connoisseur of modern elections, as Wisconsin being tilt blue and Michigan and Pennsylvania being lean blue is exactly what we saw in 2020, where Biden won Michigan by less than a point and won Wisconsin by less than a point, but won Michigan and Pennsylvania by a lean margin. In fact, in this scenario, Kerry actually did better than Biden, doing about a point better in both Michigan and Pennsylvania, yet doing slightly worse in Wisconsin. Fun fact. So, with that said, there could be a few little other bits that I could rant about in the 2004 election as an overall picture prior to getting into specifics, but this is pretty much the overall map. Oh, another fun note, while we're looking at the map here, there are a couple other little things to mention. Missouri was likely red, as it was also in 2012. And I think in 2000 it was lean. So this was also the second to last time that Missouri was a likely red state. This was the last time in which Tennessee, West Virginia, Arkansas, and Louisiana were likely red states. This was the last time also that South Carolina, Georgia, and Texas were all deep red states, as well as the last time that Nebraska's 2nd congressional district was deep red, in terms of Bush winning it by 22 percentage points. Later on, Biden went to win it by 6.6, and even managed to narrow down the 1st district in Nebraska as well. Also, Kansas. Kansas actually voted to the left of Missouri in 2020. In 2004, that was surely not the case, as Kansas was a 25-point Bush victory. Missouri was only 7 points. This is also the last time that Arkansas was considered a battleground state, which I kind of alluded to earlier by it being deep red, starting with 2008. So there were a lot of coalitions in 2004 that were still sort of forming in terms of the South sort of being deep red and more of the southern states being a little bit more competitive in the case of North Carolina and Virginia, and being a little bit less competitive in terms of West Virginia, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee. Arizona, funnily enough, was pretty close to what it was for a while before it also narrowly flipped in 2020. New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada have very, very close, or very, very farly, that's not a word. I've been talking for too long and now my words are starting to not make sense. You get what I'm trying to say if you know the history. These 3 states are now Democratic states, even Arizona. Democrats have been doing a lot better in the Sun Belt region, whereas Republicans are obviously doing a lot better in the Rust Belt. As the last 2 elections, Donald Trump has pretty much carried Ohio and Iowa. I just showed them backwards, but you know what I'm talking about. Carried Ohio and Iowa by likely margins in both cases, in both of his elections, carrying the states by 8 points. Iowa technically 9 in 2016, still within the same margin. And also on the same token, this is the last time that Virginia went red, like I mentioned earlier, but not just red, likely red. Very, very funnily enough. And of course, Virginia is an honorable mention as of the time that I film this video, because the governor elections in Virginia just happened and Glenn Youngkin, the Republican candidate, actually defeated former Governor Terry McAuliffe. Right now, he is leading by about 2 points and the race has already been called. I actually called the point percentage of victory of 2.2% as of now exactly correct. What I didn't predict was the winner. And that's another reason why I kind of started to start this show, because my Virginia prediction was a little bit wrong, given the fact that I predicted McAuliffe to win. Youngkin actually defeated McAuliffe. And on the presidential level, Bush defeated Kerry by 8 points, And then, of course, later on, Obama went to win it by almost the same margin. It got very close in 2012, and it since then has been moving steadily to the left since, with Biden winning it by 10 points. So that's another really interesting thing to mention. This also interesting note was also pretty much the last time that ME2, that specifically Maine's 2nd District, voted the same way that the rest of the state of Maine did, because also, same thing with Nebraska, whereas in later elections, they all voted differently to some degree, with either one district flipping or at the very least the margins being narrower in the 2nd District compared to the rest of the elections. Both of these happened in 2012, and in 2016 we saw a rapid shift in the state of Maine, and that has pretty much split in both directions, more so to the left, especially with Maine at large, but also in both directions since then. So now Maine's 2nd District is almost considered a Republican stronghold. It'll be interesting to see if it becomes more competitive as time goes on. But again, going back to 2004, we can see that's a very different story. Also, the last time that Illinois was a likely state. Prior to this, it was a solid Democratic state and still is to this day. As a resident of Illinois, I can attest to that. Rural Illinois is pretty much ignored as a result of Chicago and Champaign pretty much taking over the vast majority of the Democratic support, and as a result dragging the state into a deep blue territory. It is possible this could shift in the future as the suburbs of Chicago tend to grow a little bit less, and there tends to be more people leaving Chicago and leaving the state of Illinois, but it'll be interesting to see how this is affected. Also in very similar states like Pennsylvania, which has always maintained as of recent elections the same electoral vote count as the former state of Illinois, but because Pittsburgh isn't very deep in terms of its blueness as Chicago is, especially when compared to its population, and also Philadelphia, I can't believe I forgot Philadelphia, it's not as deep as Illinois is. But this is also the first time that Vermont was actually won by a safe margin. In 2000, it was a likely state. Gore barely didn't even win it by double digits, yet Kerry won it by over 20 points. This is also a scenario in which states like Maryland, New Jersey, and Connecticut actually, and as well as Hawaii, weren't safe states anymore because of Bush's, because of Bush's increase nationally and him winning the popular vote. He's been able to kind of pull some of that support away from the Democrats in this election. Don't worry though, they gained it all back 4 years later, as evidenced by by modern standards, electoral blowout of Barack Obama, and he also did the trick of avenging Senator John Edwards in the state of North Carolina, a feat that has not been replicated since. It's been lean red, ever since. Maybe my little Freudian slip there was a little bit of possible predicting for the 2024 election, but time will tell. So, I think that is pretty much it as far as notable mentions of the 2004 election. Of course, I could go over every other state, California and Washington, especially California, that, again, just under double digits. This has been a solid Democratic state ever since then. Washington and Oregon have also been safe states. As of the most recent election, they are now safe. There was a brief time in between where they were likely, but they're now effectively safe Dem states, as is Delaware, Connecticut, and New Jersey. I just said that wrong, but you get the idea. So there is a lot of shifts in the demographics right now. Now, also, Texas was safe in both of Bush's elections. Now, you could argue that was just because Bush was from Texas, but this is a 22-point margin of victory. There isn't that much there, and obviously, it's kind of hard to make that argument as much because Edwards did not help very much in the state of North Carolina. Kerry did win Massachusetts by a very, very good amount, as did Cheney in Wyoming, but there isn't much there. Technically, both Cheney and Bush were from Texas, so that could also fuel the argument as to why Texas was so heavily deep red in this election. And the fact that Texas was deep red and California was only likely blue, with pretty much literally the only safe blue states other than D.C., which is not a state, being New York, Vermont, and Massachusetts and Rhode Island, it's easy to see why the Republicans were able to win the popular vote in this election. The amount of solid red states and practically solid red states is pretty overwhelming. We can see states like Alaska, 25% victory, Utah, a 45% victory. This is a state that's narrowed up in 2016 and 2020 by 18 and 20 points. Perhaps a future battleground? We'll see. But as far as going back to 2004, we can see that there is a lot of competitiveness. And unfortunately, John Kerry was not, well, I should say, unfortunately, if you are a supporter of John Kerry and the Democrats, John Kerry did not win this election. And for those wondering, this election was pretty evenly split in regards to the popular vote. If you actually add support to Kerry, because as we know, Bush won by 3 points. If we add 3 points to Kerry, then he actually wins the election. So this is one of those elections which the popular vote does very closely mirror the electoral vote in terms of the diversifying of coalitions. That was completely the wrong terminology. I don't know why I said that. In terms of the popular vote and the electoral vote not having a huge disparity between one another like we've seen in the last 2 elections. After all, we have seen that in the last couple elections, it's been very, very close in terms of the Electoral College, despite the popular vote being pretty cut and dry in terms of the lead. As you can see, the Democrats leading by 2 points did not help them carry the Rust Belt. 1% of increase in that support would have handed them the election. And in terms of the 2020 election, do I need to say a lot? There was a massive amount of votes, Joe Biden winning by 7-8 million votes, and just a few shifting, oh my god, that is not proper grammar, just a few levels of shift in 3 states, and the entire election would have been deadlocked, and we would have had the House of Representatives pick the president, which probably would have led to the re-election of Donald Trump. And again, this is despite the massive popular vote victory of Joe Biden, but because there was very different coalitions in different states being kind of adding and running up the popular vote numbers, while a lot of states that are worth a lot of electoral votes still remain relatively tight, that's been another reason why we see some discrepancies in the popular vote and the electoral vote. And given the amount of states that are increasing in population and states that are losing population, as well as the amount of states that are becoming and outgoing in terms of being deep red or deep blue, I think we are in for a few more elections in not too far from now history where the popular vote and the electoral vote could still be different. And as of now, it does not seem like that advantage will benefit the Democrats anytime soon. We are clearly in for a few more elections where Republicans will win the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. As evidenced right here with the updated 2024 map, this could be 2024, where simply the shift in electoral vote count will hand Trump a 273 electoral vote victory, or any Republican nominee for that matter, and the Democrat, in this case the incumbent Joe Biden, or perhaps Vice President Kamala Harris, could literally win by 5-6 million votes and several percentage points and still go on to lose the election narrowly. So that is another fun fact that we do not see in the 2004 election, which is another reason why it's so hard to muscle memory to get me to select the right one. But that's another fun little fact about the election when you compare it to our modern day elections. This was very evenly split in terms of the popular vote and the electoral vote, which is a bit odd given the previous history. After all, this was a very, very close election in which the popular vote was basically tied, but yeah, Democrats did still win the popular vote by about half a point and lose because of Florida. Although this one is so close that literally a few hundred votes in Florida, perhaps 1,000 votes switching to Al Gore, would have given the same result on the other side and had zero impact on the national popular vote in terms of real impact. So it is kind of hard to make that argument in 2000 because it was incredibly close. And 2004, it's a lot more cut and dry down the middle. The winner of the popular vote, for the most part, wins the electoral vote. 2004 was no exception to that general rule, unlike the next election in which a Republican was elected after 2004. So I think that's pretty much it. I think I've wasted enough of your time regarding the general overview of the 2004 presidential election. So we're going to I'm kind of just spitballing here, and I'm just kind of trying to get a feel for how I want to do this over time, and hopefully you find this entertaining. Hopefully you find it valuable. If you'd like to see more election coverage very similar to this in terms of past elections and my future predictions, then subscribe to Untitled Talks. Hopefully this will be interesting enough, and if not, then hopefully I can just do it for fun whenever I have time not working on my main channel. And yeah. So now, as far as the comments, of course, I didn't always start being a political channel. Let's remember to keep it civil. This is just elections we're talking about. I don't agree with the mindset that politics should be inherently toxic. I think that any important discussion should be able to be had without negativity and without any, well, I guess I shouldn't say negativity, but without civility. So I know that may be kind of hard to say in today's political climate, as there's a lot of heat on both sides, but hopefully we can have a nice discussion about this election without, well, grabbing at each other's throats. So, anyways, this is Untitled Studios signing out, and just for fun, we're going to go ahead and see what a massive landslide looks like on either side of this coin, starting off with the person who won the election, George W. Bush. What happens if we add 15 points to his win? Oops, that's a landslide. 485 electoral votes. And at this point, this is essentially a Reagan versus Mondale situation, with John Kerry being Walter Mondale and George W. Bush effectively serving as Ronald Reagan. In this scenario, George W. Bush would win re-election by 18 points, and this would be a pretty big blowout. Although Kerry would still do better than Mondale did, as instead of only winning one state, the state of Minnesota, he would win his home state of Massachusetts, as well as pick up Rhode Island and Vermont, the District of Columbia as per usual, and the state of New York. So he still manages to get in the upper, I should say the middle tens in terms of electoral vote count. Now, if we move this back to be a little bit of a more modest victory, oh, that's the wrong direction. So if we add a 10-point shift to Kerry, we still see pretty much a blowout, with him as a result picking up Connecticut, Maryland, and Illinois, and Maine's 1st district. Now if we go back another 5 points, we can see still pretty much a blowout with 355 electoral votes. This is then essentially the equivalent of Bush winning by about 7 points, at least if my math is correct. So, in fact, I can kind of double check on that by looking at the margins here. Yeah, that looks about right. So, yeah, that makes sense. So, if I added 5 points to Bush's victory, that would equate to a 7-point win, or actually an 8-point win, because he originally won by 3. Adding 5 points to that, that's an 8-point win in the favor of George W. Bush. So, in this scenario, Kerry still manages to hold on to Washington and California, and even still Hawaii. So even in a scenario where Bush massively outperforms his polls, the toss-up state that is Hawaii still manages to go Democratic by a lean margin. So that's a fun fact. Same story with New Jersey. Not so with Michigan. So now we're going to essentially do the same thing. We're going to reset the map and go back. By the way, the website that I forgot to mention that I'm using for this is map.jacksonjude.com. I will link this in the description in case you want to play around with electoral vote maps yourself. So, now on the opposite side, what if Kerry had won the popular vote by 2 points, in a very similar vein to what Hillary Clinton was able to do in 2016? Well, unlike Hillary Clinton, Kerry does not lose in this scenario. He actually wins 298 electoral votes, and if he just does a little bit better, he wins 325, with the difference being Florida. So this is actually a very interesting scenario where basically Kerry winning the election by about 2% in terms of the popular vote would be a lot more solid of a victory compared to Clinton's popular vote margin in 2016, and you can definitely see that disparity there. And in this case, he would win by about 3 to 4 points. And that is pretty much that conclusion. Once you see this map, you can actually kind of see the blueprint for how states like Arizona and Virginia become competitive as time goes on, even with just a straight number shift. Obviously, if these elections were actually held and these candidates actually won by this percentage in the popular vote, first off, That's very impressive. Landslides don't really happen anymore. But second of all, usually it would not be the exact same percentage of vote in every single state. There still would be some differences, but this is just a fun little tool to mess with. Now, after we do this, we can move this another 5 points and see where Kerry will actually flip narrowly the state of Arizona, something that was not possible in 2008. I guess, well, realistically possible. Here you can actually see Nebraska's 2nd district getting pretty competitive. Missouri, Arkansas, and Virginia, of course, flipped to the Democrats. If this was a scenario in which the economic crash of 2008 essentially happened 4 years earlier and the overall electorate did not improve of the Iraq War, maybe this would be the map. So, who knows? I still would have my doubts about Arizona, but the other 3 certainly possible. And shifting it a couple more percentages, here we can see that the former Democratic stronghold of West Virginia is won back in this scenario alongside its bluer brother, and John Edwards finally gets his revenge, and the Kerry Edwards ticket, Kerry, North Carolina. This looks a lot closer to what 2008 actually was, although still a couple states here and there being a bit different. So, in the actual scenario, if this was a true Kerry victory, Florida would be a lot more narrow. West Virginia would probably not be carried at all, and a lot of the southern states would be a little bit more solid, and Missouri is pretty much traded for Indiana in that instance, and Arkansas might have been carried in this scenario, but it's hard to say. I would probably wager that Arkansas would be carried, whereas Arizona and West Virginia would not be if this was a 2008 electoral style scenario, but for John Kerry. So I think that's enough messing around with the electoral map. This was Untitled Studios with a basic overview of the 2004 election. I don't think another note about this election that I'd like to mention that a lot of people don't talk about is that the 2004 election actually had very, very good turnout, which the general consensus among a lot of people in politics is that generally whenever there is very good turnout, generally that benefits Democrats, especially on the presidential level. 2004 was an example where there was pretty good turnout, and yet George W. Bush, the Republican candidate, was still able to win re-election as well as win the popular vote. Now, obviously, it's a little bit easier to see this case, especially after 2020, where there was record-breaking turnout, broke pretty much every single record book for both candidates, and yet it still was very, very close electorally. So that's a little bit easier to believe nowadays when we can see that Republicans and Democrats can both turn out to a very good degree, to the point where it is still a very tight race, even in scenarios where we have massive election turnout. But this is also a scenario in which there was still pretty good turnout in the election of 2004, and of course nobody really thinks about that, because when they think of turnout in the early 2000s, what do they think of? Well, they think of 2008, and that's logical because there was even more turnout in 2008, much more than 2004, but in this case it favored the other candidate by a pretty heavily set degree. So I think that is pretty much it as far as the overview of the 2004 election. I keep repeating myself, and my apologies for that. I am just kind of playing around with this in general. If you thought the video was too long, if you want to be a bit more concise with it, please leave a comment below on any suggestions you might have for me to improve this type of content in the future. If you want me to edit these videos to make them a bit more succinct, maybe make a checklist for these overview videos to go over specific points and then break it down into more videos in the future on the topic, in this case of 2004, then certainly leave those comments in the comment section. I'd love to hear it. And anyways, again, this is Intelitech Studios / Intelitech Talks, signing out with the basic overview of the 2004 presidential election. If you want to see me do more videos on my previous election predictions, like the Virginia governor's race that I previously mentioned, and an update on my 2020 presidential election that I did on my main channel a while ago, and various other things, then be sure to drop that in the comments below. This channel isn't primarily politics. It isn't, or I shouldn't say it isn't only politics, but I figured it was relevant at the time. Why not talk about it? It's just what I felt like talking about today. So, yeah. I don't have to just talk about politics on this channel. And if you'd like to see non-political content, maybe more like life stories and, life advice that I could give and anything like that, then definitely leave those suggestions in the comments below. I'll see you guys in the next video, and I hope y'all have a good one. Peace.